I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth.
Who are you really?
I'm not who you think I am.
Daddy, look what I made!
She came back to say goodbye. What was waiting for her would change everything. Ava Bennett didn't believe in miracles. She believed in overdue bills, double shifts, and mornings spent crying in parking lots before walking into work with a straight face. 12 years. That's how long she had stayed away from Millfield. Away from the memories, away from the failure, away from the ghost of a boy who once held her hand and then disappeared without a single word. She wasn't coming back to stay. She was coming back for one weekend, one birthday cake, one hug from her mother. And then she was leaving again. That was the plan. Plans, as it turns out, have a way of falling apart the moment you stop paying attention. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Greyhound bus smelled like old coffee and somebody's fast food from 3 stops back. Ava had the window seat, her forehead resting against the glass, watching the landscape outside slowly shift from concrete and highway billboards to something quieter. 2-lane roads, tree lines, a water tower she recognized from 100 miles away because her father used to point at it every time they drove past it when she was a kid. Almost home, he'd say, every single time. Like it was the most important thing in the world. She pressed her fingers against the cold window and told herself she wasn't nervous. She was just tired. There was a difference. Her phone buzzed, a text from her coworker Dana back in Boston. "You actually going through with it?" Ava typed back. "It's one weekend. I'll survive." Dana's response came fast. "You say that like you're heading into battle." "I am," Ava thought. She didn't send that. She tucked the phone into her jacket pocket and closed her eyes. The plan was simple. Friday evening, arrive. Saturday, her mother's birthday dinner, small, quiet, whatever her mom wanted. Sunday morning, back on the bus. Clean, efficient, no drama. She had done harder things in her life than spend 48 hours in the town she grew up in. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. Millfield, New Hampshire, had a population of around 4,000 people, depending on which census you believed and whether you counted the Hargrove family who technically lived on the county line. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges that turned spectacular colors in October and looked plain and gray the rest of the year. There was one main road, a diner that had been there since 1974, a hardware store, 2 churches, and a bar called Patty's that everyone called Patty's, even though the woman who opened it had been dead for 15 years. Ava had grown up on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the elementary school. She had ridden her bike down that street so many times as a kid that she could still close her eyes and feel every crack in the asphalt. She knew which neighbors kept dogs, which houses always smelled like something good baking, which corner of the street flooded when it rained hard in spring. She knew Millfield the way you know a place when you've grown up poor in it. Not just the geography, but the weight of it. Who had money, who didn't, who pretended. She knew that the Sterlings owned half the commercial property on Main Street and 3 of the largest farms in the county. And she knew that knowing that had never felt like useful information until the summer she was 17 and fell completely, stupidly in love with Mason Sterling. She wasn't thinking about that now. She was just tired, just coming home for a birthday cake. The bus pulled into the small station on Route 9, which wasn't really a station. It was a parking lot adjacent to a gas station, with a bench and a metal sign that said Millfield in faded green letters. Ava grabbed her duffel bag from the overhead rack and climbed off into the October air. She stopped. She stood very still for a moment, her bag hanging from one shoulder, and she looked at the street ahead of her. Something was different. The gas station, the one that had been boarded up and spray-painted with a mural that nobody had asked for, was open. Clean windows, new pump canopies, a kid in a bright vest wiping down the glass with a squeegee. Across the street, where there had been an empty lot for as long as she could remember, there was now a small park. Benches, actual grass, a maple tree that had been planted recently enough that someone had put a support stake in the ground beside it. She started walking toward Main Street, and the strangeness grew. The old pharmacy was open again, its awning a deep blue she didn't recognize, the window display tidy and professional. The hardware store had new siding. Patty's Bar had a fresh coat of paint, forest green, with a small chalkboard sign out front listing a weekend special. Even the sidewalks looked repaired. No cracked concrete jutting up to trip you. No missing chunks where tree roots had pushed through. Millfield did not look like a town that was dying anymore. Ava had been watching small towns die her whole adult life. She'd grown up in one, worked in others, read the news stories about shuttered storefronts and declining populations, and young people who left and never came back. She knew what that looked like. She knew what it felt like. This was not that. She walked the 3 blocks to her parents' house with her bag slung over one shoulder and a strange, slow feeling building in her chest that she couldn't quite name. When she turned onto Elm Street and saw the house, she stopped again. The house her parents had lost. She had been 22 when it happened. 2 years out of high school, working at a call center in Manchester, sending home a little money every month because her father's back had gotten bad enough that he couldn't work full shifts anymore, and the medical bills had started piling up. The bank had started foreclosure proceedings. Ava had called 3 times, negotiated, written letters. None of it mattered. The bank took the house when she was 23. Her parents moved into a rental on the other side of town. Her father never talked about it. Her mother cried once, in the kitchen, and then never brought it up again. That was how they handled things in the Bennett family. You felt it once, you folded it up, and you put it somewhere you didn't have to look at it. So why were her parents' cars parked in the driveway of 14 Elm Street? Ava crossed the street slowly, like approaching something she didn't entirely trust. The house looked good. Better than it had ever looked when they were struggling to maintain it. The porch railing had been fixed, the shutters were painted. Someone had planted something along the front walk, small shrubs, still young. She walked up the porch steps and knocked, even though some part of her recognized it as absurd to knock on the door of the house you grew up in. Her mother opened the door and broke into a full, unreserved smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You made it." Carol Bennett grabbed her daughter's face with both hands the way she always had, the way that embarrassed Ava until she was about 30, and then suddenly she didn't mind it anymore. "You look thin." "I'm fine, Mom. Why are you in this house?" Carol blinked. "What do you mean? We live here." "You—" Ava looked past her mother into the hallway. Same layout, same staircase. The wall where her father used to hang his fishing photographs had photographs on it. "You live here? Since when?" "Come inside." Her mother stepped back. "I'll make tea." The kitchen was warm and smelled like the vegetable soup her mother had been making since Ava was 8 years old. Her father, Frank Bennett, was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, and he looked up when Ava came in and gave her the kind of smile that fathers give when they're glad to see you but don't have the words for it. "Hey, kid." "Dad." She hugged him, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that she always felt when she saw how he'd aged. He was 61 now. He moved differently, slower, more careful, but his eyes were the same, sharp. "What is going on? Why are you in the old house?" Frank and Carol exchanged a look. The kind of look long-married people exchange when they've agreed on a version of a story and they're checking which one of them is going to tell it. "We got it back," Frank said simply. "Got it back." Ava set her bag down on a chair. "Dad, the bank foreclosed on this house 8 years ago. What do you mean you got it back?" "There's a company," her mother started carefully. "A community investment company. They work in small towns. They bought the house," Frank said, "and they rented it to us at what they called a community rate. And then about 2 years ago, they transferred the deed. We own it outright now." He said this last part in the flat, factual tone of a man who still couldn't entirely believe it. Ava sat down across from him. Her tea was cooling in her hands, and she was looking at her father the way she used to look at math problems in school. Like if she stared long enough, the answer would make itself clear. "Who is this company?" "Hartwell Community Partners," Carol said. "They've done a lot in Millfield. The pharmacy reopening, the new park, the sidewalks." "Yes. The hardware store. And 3 other businesses on Main Street." Her mother wrapped both hands around her own mug. "They helped the Grangers when they were about to lose the farm. The Kowalski family, their son needed surgery, and somehow the bills just were handled." Ava looked at her mother. Handled how? Carol shook her head slightly. We don't ask. People here have learned not to ask. That doesn't bother you? Her parents looked at each other again. What bothers me, Frank said quietly, is that I couldn't keep this house the first time. What doesn't bother me is that my wife gets to sleep in the bedroom she loves, and I get to drink my coffee at this table. He looked at Ava steadily. Some things you just accept. Ava wanted to push back on that. She had spent 12 years pushing back on things, on landlords, on insurance companies, on supervisors who thought her time was worth less than their convenience. Accepting things gracefully had never come naturally to her. But she looked at her father's face, and she didn't push. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her old bedroom, which was now a guest room, neutral paint and a quilt she didn't recognize, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about anonymous investment companies that bought foreclosed houses and gave them back to families for free. She thought about the Kowalski boys' surgery bills being handled. She thought about the Granger's farm. She thought about the pharmacy and the park and the hardware store siding. She reached for her phone and searched. Hartwell Community Partners. The website was minimal. A logo, a mission statement about sustainable community development, a contact form. No names, no leadership team page, no board of directors listed. The address listed was a law firm in Boston. She searched the law firm. Legitimate, corporate, client list not public, obviously. She searched state business filings. Hartwell Community Partners, LLC, registered in Delaware, operating in New Hampshire. Registered agent, a holding company called Aldridge Group. She searched Aldridge Group. She hit a wall. Whoever owned this chain of companies had done a thorough job of making sure their name didn't appear anywhere obvious. That was either very sophisticated philanthropy or something she didn't have a word for yet. Ava put her phone face down on the quilt and listened to the house settle around her in the dark. The house her parents lost. The house her parents somehow had back. We don't ask, her mother had said. Ava had never been good at not asking. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, the way October mornings in New Hampshire do when they mean business. Ava pulled on jeans and a flannel shirt and went downstairs to find her mother already in full birthday preparation mode, which meant the kitchen was warm and cluttered, and Carol Bennett was moving between the counter and the stove with the focused energy of someone conducting an operation. Sit, Carol instructed without turning around. Coffee's done. Ava poured herself a cup and sat at the table. Through the window, she could see the backyard. Her father had put a bird feeder up. 3 chickadees were arguing over it. Mom, is Dad working? Mm-hmm. Part-time at the Granger farm, 3 days a week, light work. They made sure of it. Carol paused over a mixing bowl. He needed to be doing something. You know how he is. Ava knew. Frank Bennett was the kind of man who needed his hands busy or his mind went to dark places. Who arranged that? Her mother gave her a look over her shoulder. Ava, I'm just asking. The Grangers needed the help. Your father needed the work. It worked out. Carol turned back to her mixing bowl. Stop picking at everything. Ava drank her coffee. Outside, the chickadees had sorted out their differences. One of them sat alone on the feeder, very pleased with itself. She was going to take a walk into town. She needed air, and she needed to see this Millfield transformation with her own eyes in daylight, at ground level, not through a bus window. She pulled on her jacket and told her mother she'd be back in an hour. Main Street on a Saturday morning in October had always had a particular feeling. Slow, a little sleepy, people moving at the pace of people who have nowhere urgent to be. That hadn't changed, but the backdrop of it had. Ava walked the full length of Main Street from the old mill at one end to the post office at the other and counted. 7 storefronts that she remembered as empty or struggling were now open and appeared to be doing real business. Not tourist-facing stuff. A tailor, a small accounting office, a bakery, a shop selling locally made furniture. Things that served the people who actually lived here. The diner was still there. Of course it was. The Millfield Diner had survived 2 recessions and a kitchen fire in 2009, and Ava was fairly confident it would outlast human civilization. The sign was still the same faded blue. She pushed open the door. The warmth hit her first, then the smell. Coffee and bacon and something sweet. Probably the cinnamon rolls that Betty Marsh had been making since before Ava was born. Betty herself was behind the counter, maybe 10 years older and 7 pounds lighter than Ava remembered, pouring coffee with the practiced economy of someone who has poured several thousand cups. Ava Bennett. Betty's face opened into a wide smile. Lord, look at you. Sit down, honey. Coffee? Please. Ava took a stool at the counter. The diner was about half full. Locals, all of them. Nobody she recognized except distantly. Faces she could place to streets or family names, but not to specific memories. You're home for Carol's birthday? Betty set a mug in front of her. Just the weekend. Betty refilled someone else's cup down the counter without looking. Town's changed a bit since you were last here. Yeah. Ava wrapped her hands around the mug. I noticed. You know anything about this Hartwell company? Betty's expression shifted. Not defensive exactly, but careful. I know they helped us fix the roof, she said, 3 years ago. We were looking at closing. They came in with a low-interest business development loan, and she made a small gesture that encompassed the diner, the warmth, the smell of cinnamon rolls, all of it. We're still here. Do you know who runs it? Betty looked at her for a moment. Honey, I learned a long time ago that some things you don't need to know to be grateful for. She moved away down the counter. Ava had just opened her mouth to respond when the door behind her opened, letting in a brief blade of cold October air, and she turned automatically. The reflex of someone who grew up in a small town, where you always looked to see who came in. She turned, and the coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. Mason Sterling was 32 years old and looked like someone had taken the boy she remembered and made him into something more serious, more careful, with all the easy confidence filed down and replaced with something quieter and more guarded. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she'd just forgotten. Dark hair, the kind of jaw that suggested he'd stopped smiling as freely as he used to. He was wearing a dark jacket over a gray Henley, and he was holding a small girl's hand, a child of maybe 5 or 6, with his same dark eyes and a purple backpack shaped like a turtle. He was looking at his daughter, saying something to her about sitting in a booth, and then he looked up, and he saw Ava. The room didn't go quiet. Nobody else noticed. Betty was taking an order at the far end of the counter, and the man in the booth by the window was reading something on his phone, and the couple near the door were arguing quietly about whether they needed more syrup. But between Ava and Mason, there was a full, ringing second of absolute stillness. His expression moved through several things in rapid succession. Shock, something that looked briefly like relief, and then a careful, closed-down professionalism that settled over his face like a door swinging shut. Ava. His voice was lower than she remembered. Mason. Hers came out steadier than she expected. His daughter was looking up at her with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a small child who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't staring. Hi, the little girl said. Hi. Ava looked down at her. What's your name? Lily. Hi, Lily. I'm Ava. I know, Lily said. Daddy said... She stopped. She looked up at her father. Daddy, I want the cinnamon roll. Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yeah, he said, without taking his eyes off Ava. Sure, Bug. Let's find a seat. You can sit here, Betty called from down the counter, gesturing toward the booth directly behind Ava's stool. Because of course she did. Because this was Millfield, and in Millfield the universe had a very small sense of humor. Mason guided his daughter to the booth and sat across from her. Ava turned back to her coffee. She could feel him behind her the way you feel a heat source. Not warm exactly, more like the awareness of something present, something that changed the shape of the air. Betty appeared in front of her with raised eyebrows and the expression of a woman who had seen everything and was very much enjoying this particular development. Ava gave her a look that she hoped communicated, don't. Betty communicated back that she was absolutely going to. More coffee? Betty asked, in the tone of someone performing innocence. I'm good. Ava looked down at her mug, which was still 3/4 full. Behind her, she heard Lily explaining to her father in great detail about why the turtle backpack was better than the dinosaur backpack, which she had also considered. Mason responded in low, brief affirmatives the way parents do when they're listening to one thing and thinking about another. Ava finished her coffee in the time it takes to decide something is strange enough that you can't walk away from it. She put money on the counter, pulled on her jacket, and turned to leave. Mason's booth was directly between her stool and the door. She could walk around it. She didn't. She stopped at the edge of the booth. Lily was coloring on a paper placemat with a crayon she'd produced from somewhere inside the turtle backpack. Mason looked up at Ava with that careful, guarded expression. "You're back," he said. It wasn't a question. "Just the weekend. My mother's birthday." He nodded once. "How long has it been?" 12 years? He held her eyes for 1 second too long. "You look well." "You look like you own half the town," she said. She hadn't meant to say it quite like that, but she also hadn't meant to be standing in the Millfield diner 12 years later looking at Mason Sterling's daughter drawing a purple house on a paper placemat, and here they were. Something moved through his face, gone before she could name it. "I should go," she said. "My mom's cooking. Tell Carol happy birthday." He said it simply, like he knew her mother, like the mention of her name was natural in his mouth. Ava looked at him for one more second. Then she looked at Lily, who had looked up from her placemat and was regarding Ava with those serious dark eyes. "Bye, Lily." "Bye, Ava," Lily said, and then she went back to her purple house. Ava walked out of the diner into the cold October air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her hands in her pockets, breathing slowly. She had known she might run into him. Millfield was 4,000 people. She had prepared herself for the possibility, the same way you prepare yourself for a cold shower. You know it's coming, you know it'll be unpleasant, and then it happens and it's still somehow a shock. What she had not prepared herself for was the way he looked at her, or the fact that he apparently knew when her mother's birthday was. The birthday dinner that night was small. Just Ava and her parents and her Aunt Ruth, who drove up from Nashua and brought a store-bought pie and talked throughout most of the meal about her neighbor's ongoing dispute with the town over a fence. It was comfortable. It was normal. It was exactly the kind of evening Ava had been telling herself she wanted. She sat across from her father and watched him laugh at something Ruth said and thought about how she hadn't seen him laugh like that in a long time. Not strained, not careful, just easy. After dinner, after Ruth left and her mother had wrapped the leftover cake with the particular care she gave to things she intended to enjoy later, Ava helped her father with the dishes. They stood side by side at the sink the way they used to when she was a teenager, and for a few minutes nobody said anything. "Dad?" "Mason Sterling is in town." Her father was quiet for a moment. He handed her a pot to dry. "I know." "You knew he was here?" "He's been here for about 3 years." Frank kept his eyes on the sink. "Bought property, has an office up on Ridge Road." Ava dried the pot carefully. "And you didn't think to mention that?" "You don't come home much." He said it without accusation, just fact. Didn't seem worth a phone call. She put the pot away in the cabinet where it had always been kept, because apparently some things didn't change regardless of what happened to the house between now and then. "Were you going to tell me this weekend?" "I figured you'd run into him." Her father turned off the water and dried his hands. "Small town." "He has a daughter." "Lily, good kid, quiet." Frank folded the dish towel and set it over the oven handle. "Her mother's not in the picture." Ava leaned against the counter. "Do you know what his company is?" Her father looked at her then. His expression was not quite readable. "What do you mean?" "Hartwell Community Partners, Aldridge Group, whatever it's connected to." She watched her father's face. "Dad, do you know who's behind it?" Frank Bennett looked at his daughter for a long moment. He had the kind of face that didn't lie easily. You could always see the effort it cost him to hold something back. He opened his mouth, and then he closed it again. "Go to bed, Ava," he said finally. "You've had a long day." She pushed off the counter. "That's not a no." "It's a good night." He picked up his coffee cup and walked toward the living room. At the doorway, he paused without turning around. Some things were done with good intentions. That counts for something. He went to sit with her mother and the television came on low, the sound of some old movie they'd seen before. Ava stood alone in the kitchen of the house that wasn't supposed to be theirs anymore, looking at the dish towel hanging over the oven handle, and felt the slow, particular discomfort of realizing she had walked into the middle of something she didn't yet have the full shape of. Her father knew. Some things were done with good intentions. She picked up her phone. She opened her browser. She typed, Mason Sterling, Millfield, New Hampshire. The first results were old. A society page mention from Boston, a brief note in a business column about a private equity firm, a high school sports reference from 15 years ago. Nothing recent, nothing local, nothing connecting Mason Sterling to any community development company. But the second time she typed his name, this time combined with Aldridge Group, she found a single result. A 2-year-old article from a small regional business newsletter behind a soft paywall, with a headline she could read in the preview. Inside the quiet rebuilding of rural New Hampshire, one private investor's unlikely commitment to small-town recovery. The article was 3 paragraphs visible before the paywall cut it off. The investor was not named, but the towns mentioned were Millfield and 2 others, and the investment structure described matched exactly what she'd found in the state filings. She stared at the screen. Her brain was doing the thing it did when something started to take a shape she didn't want it to take, when the pieces were arranging themselves into a picture she hadn't asked for. Mason Sterling had been in Millfield for 3 years. Her parents had gotten this house back 2 years ago. The Kowalski boys' surgery bills had been handled. The Grangers kept their farm. 7 storefronts reopened, sidewalks repaired. Some things were done with good intentions. She put the phone down on the bed and sat with the room very quiet around her. Outside, a wind moved through the maple tree in the backyard. She could hear it through the old window frame, the same slight whistle she'd listened to as a teenager when she couldn't sleep. She thought about the way Mason had looked at her in the diner, that fraction of a second before the careful expression closed down over his face, the thing she'd seen in his eyes before he managed to put it away. She thought about him knowing her mother's birthday. She thought about her father saying some things were done with good intentions, in the voice of someone who had accepted something he didn't know how to explain. The wind moved through the maple tree again. Ava Bennett, who had spent 12 years surviving by trusting almost nothing and almost no one, lay back on the quilt she didn't recognize in the bedroom of the house that shouldn't exist, and stared at the ceiling and knew, with the particular certainty of someone whose gut has never once been wrong, that her quiet weekend had just become something else entirely. She wasn't leaving Sunday morning. She wasn't sure she was leaving at all. She didn't take the Sunday bus. She told her mother she was staying a few more days, and her mother said nothing, just nodded with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been hoping for exactly that, and was too smart to say so. She moved her duffel bag from the guest room to the small desk chair in the corner and unpacked it properly for the first time, hanging her flannel shirts in the closet next to her mother's winter coats, setting her toothbrush on the bathroom counter like she intended to be there for more than one more morning. She called Dana in Boston. "I need a few more days," she said. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, no, I don't know." She was standing at the guest room window looking at the backyard. Her father was at the bird feeder, filling it from a paper bag of seed. "Something's going on here. Something good or something bad? I genuinely don't know yet." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Is this about a person?" "No." Another pause. "Ava, it's complicated." "So it's about a person." Ava watched her father fold the top of the seed bag with the careful economy of someone who didn't like to waste anything. "I'll call you when I know more." She hung up and stood at the window a moment longer. Then she went downstairs, poured 2 cups of coffee, and took them both outside. Her father looked up when she came around the corner of the house. She held out one of the mugs. He took it without comment, and they stood together at the edge of the yard, looking at nothing in particular. "Tell me what you know," she said. Not a demand, just a request, quiet and direct the way she'd learned to be with him over the years. Frank Bennett held his coffee with both hands. He looked at the bird feeder for a long moment. One chickadee landed, assessed the situation, and left. "About 3 years ago," he said slowly, "a man came to see me. He didn't tell me who he was, said he worked for a community development company and that they'd identified our situation, our housing situation, as something they could help with, offered us the house back, rental at below market rate with an option to transfer the deed. And you said yes. I said I needed to think about it. He paused. And then I thought about your mother, and I said yes. Ava wrapped her hands around her mug. Did you know who sent him? Her father was quiet for long enough that she had her answer before he spoke. Not at first, not for a while. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. About a year in, I saw Mason Sterling at the hardware store. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't let on. But I started paying attention after that, asking careful questions of the right people. He stopped. I'm not stupid, Ava. I know you're not. And I didn't say anything because... He stopped again, and this time the stop had more weight in it, the kind of pause that holds something inside it. Because your mother sleeps in the bedroom she loves. Because I have work 3 days a week that doesn't destroy my back. Because when Tommy Kowalski needed surgery, somehow it just happened. He looked at Ava then, finally, directly. Some debts you don't know how to talk about. Ava thought about that for a moment. About the particular complicated silence of owing something to someone you have complicated feelings about. He should have told us, she said. Maybe. Frank looked back at the yard. Or maybe he knew we wouldn't accept it if he had. She didn't have an answer for that. She finished her coffee and went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and spent the next 2 hours doing what she did when she didn't know what else to do. She worked the problem methodically, the way she'd learned to work every problem that life handed her when she couldn't afford to get it wrong. She pulled up every public record she could find. State filings, property transfers, business registrations, news archives. She built a timeline on a yellow legal pad, the kind her mother kept in the kitchen drawer for grocery lists, and she connected what she could connect and left blanks where she couldn't. Hartwell Community Partners had been operating in Millfield for 4 years. The first recorded transaction was a property purchase, then a business loan, then a farm mortgage buyout, then her parents' house, then the Kowalski medical assistance, which she could only trace indirectly through a charitable trust that led back to the same network of holding companies. Mason Sterling had moved back to Millfield by her father's account roughly 3 years ago, but the company had been active for 4, which meant he'd started before he came back. He'd started it while he was still somewhere else, aimed it at a town he'd left, and spent a year running it from a distance before returning in person. She set down her pen and looked at what she'd written. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something smaller, maybe. Something more straightforwardly explainable. What she was looking at was not a tax write-off or a vanity project. It was a years-long, carefully structured, quietly executed effort to put a specific place back together. She picked her pen back up and wrote one word in the margin, circled it, why. She ran into him again on Tuesday. She hadn't planned it. She'd walked to the library to use their printer because the guest printer at her parents' house had been out of ink since approximately 2019, and she was coming back down Main Street with a folder under her arm when she almost walked directly into Mason and Lily coming out of the bakery. Lily saw her first. Ava! She said it with the uninhibited excitement of a child who has decided she likes someone and sees no reason to manage that feeling. We got muffins. I can see that. Ava looked at the paper bag in Lily's hand, which had a grease spot forming on one side that suggested the muffins were still warm. She looked up at Mason. He looked like he'd slept less than she had. There were the beginnings of tension around his eyes, the particular tight look of someone who is keeping a lot of things in order simultaneously. He was wearing the same dark jacket as Saturday. You're still here, he said. Apparently. Lily was looking back and forth between them with the focused interest of a child at a tennis match. Do you want to walk with us? We're going to the park. Lily, Mason said. The one with the new bench, Lily continued, undeterred. Daddy helped put it there. Well, he didn't put it there himself. He just... She looked up at him. How does it work when you didn't do it, but it's yours? Funded, he said, and something shifted in his face. He looked at Ava. She looked back at him. I have some time, she said. He looked like a man deciding whether to open a door he'd spent years keeping shut. Okay, he said. Just that. The 3 of them walked to the park, the small new park across from the gas station, and Lily ran ahead to claim the swing that was clearly her preferred swing, and Mason and Ava sat on the new bench under the young maple tree with the support stake still in the ground beside it. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Lily was pumping her legs on the swing with the serious concentration of a child working on altitude. "How long are you staying?" Mason asked finally. "I don't know." Ava set the folder on her knee. "I thought I was leaving Sunday." "What changed?" She looked at him sideways. "Do you actually want me to answer that?" He turned to look at her directly then, and it was the first time since the diner that he let the careful expression slip far enough for her to see past it. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been braced for something for a long time. "I know what you've been looking up," he said. "I have people who monitor certain... It doesn't matter. I know you've been pulling public records." "That bother you?" "No." He looked at Lily on the swing. "I expected it. You always needed to understand how things worked." She felt something old and sharp move through her at that. The recognition of being known by someone. The particular sting of it when that someone is a person you've spent years trying to not think about. "Then why don't you just tell me?" she said, "instead of waiting for me to piece it together from state filings." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Because it sounds different when I say it," he said finally. "When I say it, it sounds like..." He stopped. He rubbed the side of his jaw, the way she remembered he used to do when he was younger and didn't want to say something. "It sounds like something it wasn't." "And what wasn't it?" He looked at her. "It wasn't about buying anything. It wasn't about proving something, or..." He stopped again, shook his head slightly, frustrated with himself. "I'm not good at this." "You used to be," she said, and then she wished she hadn't, because it landed between them with more weight than she'd intended. He looked at the swing set. Lily had gotten very high and was very pleased about it, kicking her feet out at the top of each arc. "A lot changed," he said. "I know." She paused. "Your daughter's mother," her name was Renata. He said it evenly, the flatness of someone who has said a name in the past tense enough times that it no longer ambushes them. "She died when Lily was 18 months old. Car accident, winter roads." He paused. "Lily doesn't remember her." "I'm sorry." "Yeah." He watched his daughter swing. "It was a bad year, a few bad years, actually." Ava turned the folder over in her hands. She thought about a 20-year-old Mason Sterling, or however old he'd been, alone with an infant and a grief too large to manage, and an empire of family money pressing in around him. She thought about how alone that must have felt, and then she made herself stop thinking about it because it was easier to be angry than to feel that. "The company," she said. "Hartwell. Aldridge. Whatever it connects back to. You started it 4 years ago, before you came back." "Yes." "From wherever you were." "Boston, mostly, and New York." "And you aimed it at Millfield." He looked at her. "I aimed it at places like Millfield. Communities with the right profile, struggling but not beyond recovery. Places where targeted investment could stabilize things rather than transform them into something unrecognizable. But specifically, Millfield." The corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Specifically Millfield first." She let that sit for a moment. "Daddy!" Lily's voice came from the swings. "Watch!" They both looked. Lily had apparently decided the standard swing was insufficient challenge and was now attempting to twist the chains while swinging, which was creating an interesting spiral effect. Mason watched this with the expression of a parent calculating safety probability. "I see you, Bug," he called. "Don't let go." "I know, Daddy." Supremely confident, he exhaled. Then quietly, to Ava, "She does this thing where she's very sure she has it handled. Wonder where she gets that from." He gave her a brief, startled look, and then, for just a second, he laughed. Not much. A small, surprise sound, gone almost before it arrived. But it was real. And it was the first wholly unguarded thing she'd seen from him since the diner, and it unsettled her more than the careful version of him had. "Tell me one true thing," she said, without the company structure around it. Just one. He looked at the ground, then back at the swing set, then at her. I should have written, he said, when they separated us. When my father moved us and cut things off, I should have found a way to write. She had not expected that. She kept her face still. We were 17. I know. You could have. I know. He said it simply, without defense, which made it harder than if he'd argued. I was a coward about some things. I've been a coward about some things for a long time. Ava looked at the young maple tree with its support stake, moving slightly in the October wind. She thought about 17 years old and believing that silence meant something other than fear. She thought about the shape of that year and how long it had taken her to stop being angry about it. She hadn't entirely stopped. I should get back, she said. Okay. She stood up. Lily saw her and waved from the swings, a full arm wave, just generous and uncomplicated. Ava waved back. Thank you, Mason said from the bench. For staying. She looked at him. I'm not staying for you, she said. And then, because that was only partially true, and she was tired of things that were only partially true, I'm staying because I need to understand what happened to this town, and that's going to require talking to you. I know, he said. I'll talk. She left him on the bench and walked back toward her parents' house, and she didn't look back because looking back at Mason Sterling had always cost her something, and she wasn't sure yet what she could afford. She spent the next 3 days talking to people. Not about Mason specifically. She was careful about that. Careful the way you're careful when you suspect you're walking in a field where someone has buried things and you don't want to step wrong. She talked to people the way she used to do when she was a kid and needed to know something the adults weren't going to tell her directly, sideways, through other subjects, letting the conversation find its own way there. She had coffee with Betty Marsh at the diner on Wednesday morning and asked about the business loan terms. Betty was precise about the numbers and vague about the source, but what she described was not a commercial loan. The interest rate was too low, the repayment structure too patient, the conditions too reasonable. They never once called to check on us, Betty said, with a note of something that sounded like wonder. 3 years, and they never once sent anyone in to look at the books or ask if we were hitting targets. I kept waiting for the other shoe. Did it drop? Still waiting. Betty refilled Ava's cup. Maybe that's the shoe. On Wednesday afternoon, she drove out to the Granger farm in her mother's car. Her mother lent it without asking why, which was its own kind of answer. And she sat with Paul Granger in his kitchen and listened to a slow, careful accounting of how Hartwell had come in 2 years ago when the farm was 6 months from foreclosure, bought the mortgage at a price that covered what the bank was owed, and then restructured the debt on terms that Paul Granger called terms a man could actually breathe under. Your dad's been good out here, Paul said. He poured her water from a filter pitcher on the counter. He knows land. My father used to say that Frank Bennett knows land. He grew up on a farm, Ava said, outside of Concord, before his family lost it. She paused. A lot of losing in that generation. Yeah. Paul looked at his kitchen table, which had papers on it, the ordinary paperwork of a working farm. Receipts, seed catalogs, a calendar with dates circled. Real things. Things that meant the farm was still operating. The people who came in, they never made us feel like a charity case. That matters. He looked at her. You know how some help comes with a feeling attached to it? Like you're supposed to feel a certain way because someone did something for you? Yes, she said, because she did know. She had accepted help exactly twice in her adult life, and both times the help had come with that feeling. A subtle weight, an expectation of gratitude performed at a particular volume. There was none of that, Paul said. It was just business, just terms on paper. Nobody made a speech about it. She drove back into town thinking about that, about help that didn't require you to perform your own rescue. She'd spent enough time being poor to know that the way help was delivered mattered almost as much as the help itself, that dignity was not a luxury, that people could be made to feel small by the very thing that was supposed to lift them up. Someone had thought carefully about that. Someone had structured all of this specifically to avoid it. She thought about Mason on the bench, saying it sounds like something it wasn't. She thought about his frustration with himself, the way he rubbed the side of his jaw when the words weren't cooperating. She was angry at him. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was angry at the secrecy, angry at the architecture of companies within companies designed to keep his name away from what he'd done, angry at the 12 years of silence and the fact that he had sat on information her family had a right to know. But she was also, and this was the part she was less comfortable with, she was starting to understand something about why. She didn't want to understand it. Understanding things had a way of making anger complicated, and she needed her anger to stay simple for a little while longer. Thursday evening, Mason called her. She hadn't given him her number. She stared at the unknown number on her screen for 2 rings, and then answered because she had never been good at not answering. "How did you get this number?" "Your mother," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. "Of course. She volunteered it." A pause. "I didn't ask her to. I want to be clear about that." "I believe you. That's exactly the kind of thing my mother would do." She was sitting on the back porch steps in the cold because she'd needed air. The sky was doing something complicated with clouds in the last light of October. "What do you need, Mason?" "I want to show you something," he said. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. There's a property on the east side of town, used to be the old textile mill. We've been working on it for about 18 months. I want you to see it." "Why?" A pause. "Because I think it might help explain some things I'm not explaining well in conversation." She looked at the sky doing its complicated thing. "What time?" 9? "Fine." She started to say goodbye and then stopped. "Mason, my father said he knew, that he figured it out." She paused. Did you know he knew?" A longer pause this time. When Mason spoke, his voice was quieter. "I suspected, about 6 months ago. He was at the hardware store and he looked at me in a way that, yeah, I suspected." "And you didn't say anything to him?" "What would I have said?" She thought about her father at the kitchen table, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Some debts you don't know how to talk about." "I don't know," she admitted. "Neither did I." He paused. "Good night, Ava." "Good night." She sat on the back porch for a while after that, in the cold, listening to the wind move through the maple tree, thinking about all the things 2 people could fail to say to each other for completely different reasons. He picked her up at 9 in a truck that had mud on the tires and a child's drawing on the dashboard, held in place by a piece of tape that had started to peel at one corner. The drawing appeared to be of a horse, or possibly a very elongated dog. Lily, presumably. Ava got in without comment, and they drove to the east side of town in a silence that wasn't comfortable but was at least honest. The old textile mill sat at the bottom of a long slope near the river, a brick building from the 1890s that had been closed since before Ava was born. She had a vague childhood memory of her father telling her it used to employ half the town, that when it closed, it took something out of Millfield that never fully came back. The building had always been there, large, vacant, slowly being taken by ivy and weather, like a fact the town had learned to live around. It didn't look like that now. The ivy was gone. The windows were new, industrial metal frames, the kind that belonged in a building being used, not abandoned. A new roof. Scaffolding along the south wall where something was still being worked on. A gravel parking area that had been cleared and leveled. And through the large ground floor windows she could see light, activity, people. She got out of the truck and stood in the gravel lot looking at the building. "What is it?" she said. "Come see." He walked toward the entrance and she followed. Inside was organized chaos of the productive kind. Half the space was still raw brick and exposed beam, the renovation clearly ongoing, but the other half had been finished into a kind of mixed-use workshop and market space. Long wooden tables ran down the center. On one side, a woman was cutting fabric at a wide workbench, textiles, Ava noted, in the old textile mill, probably not an accident. On the other side, 2 men were assembling something from what appeared to be reclaimed wood. Near the back, a small storefront setup displayed jars and packaged goods. "The workshop spaces are subsidized," Mason said, walking beside her. "Locals get first access. No percentage of revenue owed, no equity stake taken. They pay utilities and a flat monthly fee that covers the cost of running the space, but nothing more." Ava stopped at the fabric woman's table. The woman looked up, mid-40s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a measuring tape around her neck. "Morning," she said pleasantly. "Morning." Ava looked at the fabric. It was good work. Even she could see that. "How long have you been here?" "In this space?" "About 4 months. I was working out of my garage before." The woman glanced at Mason. "This is a lot better than my garage." "I imagine." They moved on. Ava looked at the reclaimed wood furniture, at the jars of what turned out to be local honey and preserves, at the back corner where a young man was doing something with leather tools she didn't have the vocabulary to name. She looked at all of it and thought about what Paul Granger had said about terms a man could breathe under, about help that didn't make you feel like a charity case. She stopped in the middle of the space and turned to Mason. "Why did you hide it?" He'd been waiting for that. She could see it in the way his posture shifted, the settling of a man who knew a particular question was coming and has decided to let it land. "Because people don't accept things from people they know," he said. "Not things this size. It changes the relationship. It makes it about me instead of about the outcome." He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "And because I didn't trust myself. If people knew it was me, if you knew it was me, then every conversation becomes about that, about whether I had the right, about what I was trying to prove, about us." He said the last word without inflection, but it sat in the air of the old mill building and didn't go anywhere. Ava looked at the high brick walls, the new roof where October light came through clean windows. She thought about all the things this building had apparently become in the time she'd spent avoiding this town. "You didn't give people the right to say no," she said. "I know." He said it without flinching. "I made a decision that they would benefit more from not knowing than from having the choice. He stopped. "That's a hard thing to justify." "You shouldn't try to justify it." "I'm not." He looked at her. "I'm acknowledging it." She studied him for a long moment. The man standing in the middle of this half-finished building with his hands in his pockets, who had spent years building something in the dark, and was now standing in the light of it, with no particular way to make it look better than it was. He wasn't trying to. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He wasn't selling her on anything. The woman with the measuring tape across the room started cutting fabric again, the sound of scissors through cloth, a clean, decisive sound. "Lily," Ava said. "She's in school here?" "Yes, she loves it." Something in his face changed when he talked about his daughter. The guardedness eased slightly, the way it does with parents. "She's the kind of kid who makes friends immediately and then organizes them." Sounds exhausting. "Deeply," he almost smiled. "She asked about you this morning." Ava looked at him. "She barely knows me." "She knows you from the diner and the park." He shrugged. "That's enough for her. She has strong opinions about people very quickly." He paused. "She gets that from me." Ava thought about that, about a man who had strong opinions about people very quickly, who had structured years of his life around a place and the people in it, who had done it all from behind layers of legal entities and holding companies because he didn't trust himself to do it as himself. She was still angry. But it was changing shape, the way things do when you get more information, getting less hot and more complicated, less about what he'd done and more about why, and what it meant, and what it said about the 17-year-old boy she remembered who had also hidden things he didn't know how to say out loud. "I want to see the full list," she said. "Every family you helped, every business, every property transaction, all of it." He looked at her for a moment. Some of that is confidential, the families, not the families, the structure." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to use it against you. I just need to see the whole thing. I need to understand what I'm actually looking at." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "I'll have my lawyer pull the non-confidential documentation." Today, he agreed. She looked at the old mill building one more time, at the light coming through new windows, at the woman cutting fabric, at the man building furniture from salvaged wood, at all of it. And she thought that whatever else Mason Sterling was or wasn't, whatever she hadn't forgiven him for and wasn't sure she could, he had made something real here. Not perfect, not without its complications, but real. She walked back out into the October morning and stood in the gravel lot while he pulled the truck around, and she breathed cold air, and she thought that real was probably the most important thing a thing could be. Ava sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold before she was a quarter of the way through the first file. It was more than she'd expected, not just property transactions and business loans. There were community meeting minutes, architectural assessments of buildings deemed salvageable, soil reports from the Granger farm and 2 others, a pediatric specialist referral network that had apparently been quietly established through a medical foundation connected to the same holding company, a literacy program run out of the library that she had walked past 3 times without knowing who funded it. She read for 4 hours straight. The picture that assembled itself across those 4 hours was not what anger wanted it to be. Anger wanted a man who had bought a town to impress a woman. What the document showed was something built slowly, carefully, with the kind of attention to detail that could not be faked in a spreadsheet. Community surveys conducted before any investment decision. Local contractors hired for every renovation. A standing policy that no Hartwell-affiliated business could displace an existing local business from its location. A clause in every agreement that gave the recipient the right to exit without penalty. That last one stopped her. She read it 3 times. Every family, every business, every farmer had been given a specific right, written into the agreement, to walk away. No penalty, no clawback, no reputational consequence. If you decided you didn't want Hartwell's help after all, you could hand it back and that was the end of it. Nobody had used it. She sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had structured an exit ramp into every single thing he'd built, as if he understood at some level that the offer of help should never be a trap. Her mother came into the kitchen around 5, took one look at Ava's face, and put the kettle on without saying anything. "Mom," Ava said. "Hmm?" "When the man came, the man from the company, when they offered you the house back, did they tell you about the exit clause, that you could say no and walk away?" Her mother set 2 mugs on the counter. "They did. The lawyer explained it very carefully. He said if at any point we wanted to return the arrangement, we could, and there would be no consequence." "And that didn't strike you as strange?" Carol Bennett looked at her daughter with the patient expression of a woman who has watched her child be suspicious of good things for 30 years. "It struck me as kind," she said. "There's a difference." Ava looked back at the laptop screen. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She closed the laptop and went upstairs and lay on the quilt and looked at the ceiling, and she thought about kindness that doesn't announce itself, and about how that was either the most genuine form of it or the most sophisticated, and she wasn't sure yet which one she was dealing with. She was still working on that when her phone rang. Unknown number, Boston area code. Not Mason. Different prefix. She answered. "Is this Ava Bennett?" The voice was male, professional, with the particular efficiency of someone who makes a lot of calls. "Who's asking?" "My name is Derek Paulson. I'm a journalist with the Northeast Business Review." A brief pause. "I'm writing a piece on Hartwell Community Partners and its parent entities. I understand you've been in Millfield this week asking questions about the organization's operations." Ava sat up on the bed. "Where did you hear that?" "Small town," he said pleasantly. "People talk. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to speak with me, background only, if you prefer, off the record, about your impressions of the—" "No," she said. A pause. "Ms. Bennett, I'm not a source." She kept her voice level. "I don't know who told you I was asking questions, but I'm not in a position to comment on anything. You should contact the company directly." "The company doesn't have a public-facing contact," Paulson said. "That's actually part of what I'm looking into. The unusual opacity of the ownership structure, the anonymous nature of the philanthropy. There are investors in the parent company who have questions about how capital is being deployed." Ava felt something cold move through her. "What kind of questions?" "Whether personal relationships have influenced investment decisions." He paused, and she could hear him reading something, or pretending to. "Specifically, whether the community development activities in Millfield, New Hampshire were driven by business rationale or by Mr. Sterling's prior connection to individuals in the town." She said nothing for a moment. "Ms. Bennett? I heard you." She chose her words carefully. "I'm not a source. I have nothing to say to you. Don't call this number again." She hung up and sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in her hand and her heart doing something irregular in her chest that she recognized as the specific feeling of a situation tilting. Someone had talked. Someone in Millfield had seen her asking questions and made a connection between her and Mason, between her family's situation and Hartwell's activities, and passed that to a journalist. Or someone outside Millfield had been watching and connected the dots themselves. Either way, the careful structure of anonymity that Mason had built was developing a crack, and the crack had her name in it. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "Ava? A journalist just called me. Northeast Business Review, Derek Paulson. He knows I've been asking about Hartwell, and he's connecting it to you personally. He used the phrase, personal relationships influencing investment decisions." Silence on the other end. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of someone processing something they had already been afraid of. "When?" Mason's voice was controlled, but barely. 5 minutes ago." She heard him exhale. "Okay." "Okay?" She stood up and walked to the window. The yard was dark, the bird feeder a pale shape against the trees. "Mason, if this becomes a story, if someone publishes something connecting you to my family specifically, I know. It won't matter that your intentions were good. The headline writes itself." "I know," he said again, and this time the weight in it was different, heavier. The weight of someone who has known a particular risk for a long time and built the whole careful structure precisely to avoid it, and is now watching the structure develop a crack he can't close. "Who knew?" she said. "Who knew enough to make this connection?" A long pause. "My CFO, my lawyer, 2 people inside the holding structure." Another pause. "And one of my investors who I've been having a disagreement with about the Millfield portfolio. An investor who doesn't think small-town New Hampshire is a smart use of capital. An investor," Mason said carefully, "who recently made an offer to buy out my stake in a separate venture and was declined, who has been looking for leverage since August." Ava put her forehead against the cold window glass. Outside, the October dark was complete and the maple tree was just a shape against it. "So it's not a journalist doing investigative work. It's a hit." "It might be both." She closed her eyes. "What happens if it gets published?" "Reputational damage, investor flight from the parent company, possible SEC inquiry into the philanthropic structure." He said it with the flat precision of someone reading from a list they've already made. "And Hartwell loses its funding base, which means the community projects in Millfield become unsustainable." She opened her eyes, the bird feeder in the dark. "The families. The families that are still in agreements. Yes. The transition would be disruptive." She absorbed that. She thought about Paul Granger's kitchen table with the seed catalogs and the circled calendar dates. She thought about Betty Marsh's diner with the new roof. She thought about the mill building with the woman cutting fabric. "You need to get ahead of it," she said. "I know. You need to make the connection yourself, publicly, before he does. Control the narrative." She moved away from the window. Her brain had shifted into a gear it knew. The problem-solving gear. The one that engaged when things got bad enough that emotion became expensive. You tell the story on your terms, with full transparency about the structure and the intent, before he tells a version of it that puts you on the defensive. A pause. "That means my name on everything." "Yes. The families keep their names out, but yours goes on it." She sat back down on the edge of the bed. "Mason, you have been hiding behind the structure because you didn't want it to be about you. Now it's going to become about you whether you want it to or not. The only question is whether you control how." He was silent for long enough that she counted his breaths, or maybe those were her own. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. "You have tonight. The journalist called me at 5 p.m. He'll have filed something by morning if he has what he needs." "What does he need?" "He needs me," she said flatly, "or someone else local who'll confirm the personal connection. If he can't corroborate the angle, he doesn't have a story. He has speculation." She paused. "I'm not going to give him anything." "Ava, I said I'm not." She heard something shift in his voice at that, and she moved past it. But you need to move fast. Call your lawyer tonight. He's not going to be happy about that. No, she agreed, but he gets paid for it. She hung up, and then she sat very still in the quiet room and thought about what she'd just done. Offered to be a wall between Mason Sterling and the thing coming for him. When she was still angry at Mason Sterling and still hadn't figured out what she was going to do with all of it. She thought about the exit clause in every Hartwell agreement. She thought about Paul Granger saying they never made us feel like a charity case. She thought about her father at the kitchen table. Some debts you don't know how to talk about. She lay back on the quilt and stared at the ceiling and understood, with a clarity that was more uncomfortable than the anger had been, that what she was doing had nothing to do with forgiving Mason and everything to do with the fact that the families in Millfield had nothing to do with her feelings about Mason, and she wasn't going to let them get caught in the crossfire of something that was really about her. That was the decision. That was the only decision that made sense. It didn't make the rest of it simpler. She didn't sleep well. She was up before her parents, in the kitchen with coffee and her laptop, when her phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. with a link and a single line of text from a number she didn't recognize. The text said, "Thought you might want to see this before it goes wide." The link was to a pre-publication preview. Someone had sent her the article before it posted. She didn't know who. She didn't spend time wondering. She read it. Derek Paulson had done his work thoroughly and with a particular editorial slant that used factual information to construct a narrative that was technically accurate and fundamentally misleading. The headline read, "Billionaire's Secret Philanthropy or Strategic Play." Inside one investor's unusual ties to a small New Hampshire town. The piece named Mason Sterling. It named Hartwell Community Partners and traced the corporate structure with reasonable accuracy. It cited sources close to Sterling's investment group, the investor clearly, or someone connected to him. It described the Millfield operations in terms designed to raise questions without answering them, a pattern of community assistance that appears concentrated in a town with which Sterling has long-standing personal ties. It did not name Ava. It did not name her family, but it quoted an unnamed local source as saying that people close to Sterling personally had benefited from Hartwell's activities, and it left the reader to fill in the gap. It was clever, it was damaging, and it was going to be published in approximately 2 hours, based on the timestamp on the preview. She called Mason. "I saw it," he said immediately. He was already awake, already moving. She could hear the particular quality of his voice when he was in motion, not the careful, controlled version, but the version underneath it, the one that operated under pressure. "My lawyer is already on with Paulson's editor. That won't stop it. They'll post it." "I know." A pause. "I'm going to call them." "Who?" "Paulson. And then his editor. And I'm going to give them a better story." His voice was steady in the way that things get steady when there's no alternative to steady. "Full transparency. My name on everything. The complete picture of what Hartwell is and what it isn't. I'll give them documentation." "Today?" "Right now. I'm already at my desk." He paused. "Ava, I'm sorry. This is because of me. All of it. And I should have—" "Stop." She cut him off, not unkindly. "Do the interview. I'll deal with this end." "What does that mean?" "It means if they want a local source, I'll be one." She heard him start to object, and she kept going. "On my terms. My account of what I've seen and what I understand the operations to be. Not a puff piece. Not spin, just the actual thing. Ava, you don't have to. I know I don't have to." She looked at her coffee cup. "Do the interview, Mason." A long moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet." She closed her laptop. "Make it honest. All of it." She spent the next hour on the phone with Paulson, who was surprised to hear from her and professional enough to hide it, only partially. She told him what she'd seen. She told him about the Granger farm and Betty Marsh's diner and the mill building. She told him about the exit clause in every agreement and what it meant, about the local contractors and the anti-displacement policy and the community surveys. She did not tell him about her personal history with Mason Sterling, and he did not ask about it directly, which suggested someone had told him to keep that angle clean. She was factual. She was not warm. She did not make Mason sound like a hero. She made him sound like a complicated man who had done a real thing in an imperfect way, which was the truth as she understood it. Paulson asked her, near the end, "Do you think his motives were purely philanthropic?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think his motives were complicated," she said. "I think most people's motives are complicated. I think the question that matters isn't whether his motives were pure, it's whether the outcomes were real. And the outcomes are real. Go look at the Granger farm. Go talk to Betty Marsh. Go look at the mill building." She paused. The people in Millfield are not props in someone's personal story. They're people who got to keep their homes and their businesses because someone structured a program carefully enough that it actually worked. That's the story. Paulson was quiet on his end, then, "That's a good line." "It's not a line," she said. "It's just true." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a moment in the quiet house. Her parents were still asleep. Outside, the early light was turning the backyard gray and pale, and the chickadees were already at the bird feeder, arguing. She thought, I don't know if any of that was enough. She thought, it was the truth, and that's what I have. The article published at 9 a.m., but it was not the article Derek Paulson had written the night before. The piece that went live was longer, more balanced, and led not with the investor complaint angle, but with the mill building. Mason's interview, conducted over an hour that morning, was threaded throughout. His name was on everything. He had not hidden. The headline read, "The Town He Rebuilt in Secret, Inside Mason Sterling's Decade-Long Project to Save a Dying Community." It was not a puff piece. It raised legitimate questions about the opacity of the structure, about the ethics of anonymous philanthropy at scale, about the line between generosity and control. Ava's quotes were in the 4th and 7th paragraphs. She was identified only as a Millfield native who has been reviewing Hartwell's operations. She read it twice and thought it was about 70% of the truth, which was better than most things got. She was sitting on the back porch with that thought when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she'd just added to her contacts the night before. "Thank you." Just that. She looked at it for a moment. She typed back, "I told them the truth, that's all." His response came after a pause. "I know, that's why it helped." She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the yard. Her father would be up soon, her mother would make eggs and toast, and they would sit at the table in the kitchen of the house that shouldn't exist, and she would have to decide how much of this to tell them and in what order. She was still deciding when she heard Mason's truck on the street out front. She wasn't surprised. Small town. And she'd known him for 20 years across a 12-year gap, which was enough to know that he wasn't someone who left things in text messages when he could say them in person. She walked around to the front of the house. He was standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his jacket pockets, not on the porch, not at the door, keeping a respectful distance from the house with the particular care of someone who understood that some spaces required an invitation. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent the night doing damage control and the morning being more honest than was comfortable. "I should have told you the first day," he said. No preamble. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I should have told your family years ago." Also yes. He looked at her steadily. "I know an apology doesn't—" He stopped, started again. "I spent a long time doing things from a distance because it felt safer than doing them face to face. That's on me." She stood on the porch steps and looked at him on the sidewalk and felt the full complicated weight of 12 years and 4 days and all the things that had happened in between. The specific difficulty of looking at someone who had shaped part of who you became and knowing that neither of you were who you were when the shaping happened. "The article is going to have consequences," she said. "Investor reactions, media follow-up. It's not over." "I know." He looked up at her. "I'm not worried about that right now." "You should be." "Probably." He held her eyes. "Are you leaving?" She looked at the maple tree in the front yard. Her father had put in a stake next to that one too, this spring, supporting a young branch that had split in winter. The stake was made from a piece of the old fence, she now noticed, repurposed, her father's habit. "I don't know," she said honestly. He nodded once, like that was an answer he could work with. Lily wants to know if you want to come see her school play, he said. It's not for 3 weeks, but she asked me to ask you this morning, which is why I'm telling you now, even though it's... He looked briefly like a man who is aware he is not handling this with maximum dignity. Not the main reason I came. Ava looked at him. What is the main reason? He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to see if you were okay. She thought about that. About a man who had spent 12 years caring about her from a safe and invisible distance, who was now standing on the sidewalk in front of her parents' house in the October morning trying, imperfectly and a little late, to do it face to face. I'm okay, she said. Yeah? Don't push it. He almost smiled. It reached his eyes this time, brief and a little unsteady. Right. The front door opened behind Ava, and her mother appeared with a dish towel over one shoulder and the expression of a woman who has looked out the kitchen window and seen Mason Sterling on her sidewalk and is choosing to behave as if this is completely normal. Mason, Carol said pleasantly, have you eaten? He looked from Carol to Ava and back again. Mrs. Bennett. Carol. She had been telling him that since he was 17. Come inside, I'm making eggs. Ava turned to look at her mother, who met her eyes with an expression of perfect innocence that fooled absolutely nobody. Mom, Ava said. It's cold out, Carol said simply, and she went back inside. Mason looked at Ava from the sidewalk. She could see him working through whether to accept the invitation or hold the line of appropriate distance that the morning probably called for. She stepped back from the porch steps and held the door open. You might as well, she said. She's going to make eggs for 4 either way. He came up the porch steps and through the door, and Ava let it close behind them, and the house was warm and smelled like toast and coffee and something ordinary enough to be a relief. From the kitchen came the sound of her mother moving with purpose, and from down the hall, the sound of her father's feet on the stairs. He'd heard the door, come to investigate. Frank Bennett appeared in the hallway. He looked at Mason Sterling standing in his front hallway, and something moved across his face that was not quite readable. Not anger, not welcome exactly, but something older than both of those. The look of a man who has been holding a complicated feeling for a long time and isn't sure what to do with it now that the person it concerns is standing in front of him. Mason looked at Frank. He didn't look away. Mr. Bennett, he said. Frank looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he said, Coffee's on, and walked toward the kitchen. Mason exhaled. Ava watched him do it, the slow release of something held very tightly. She thought about all the things that had just happened in the space of 3 seconds in a hallway, all the things that hadn't been said and didn't need to be. Come on, she said. They went into the kitchen, all 4 of them, into the warmth and the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning, and Carol made eggs and nobody talked about corporate structures, or investor pressure, or leaked memos, or 12 years of absence. They talked about the Granger Farms harvest. They talked about Lily's school play, which was apparently a production of something involving woodland animals in a courtroom. They talked about the bird feeder, and which of the neighborhood cats had figured out how to reach the lower perch. It was not comfortable exactly. It had the quality of something that has been through damage and is still in the process of finding out if it will hold. But it was real, and it was human, and outside the window the October morning was getting lighter, and the chickadees were at the feeder in the yard of the house that shouldn't have existed, arguing cheerfully about who had gotten there first. Ava sat at the table with her coffee and her eggs and the quiet knowledge that she had made every decision she'd made in the last 18 hours because it was right, not because it was easy, and that she was going to have to keep making decisions like that for a while yet. About Mason, about her family, about what she was going to do with the fact that this town had somehow become, against every plan she'd made, a place she didn't want to leave. The consequences of the article were still coming. The investors' anger was still out there. The media attention would not evaporate overnight. There were things ahead that she couldn't see the shape of yet. But at the kitchen table, for right now, there was coffee and eggs, and her father asking Mason about a structural question he'd been wondering about regarding the mill building's south wall, and Mason answering in the careful, specific way of a man who actually knew the answer, and her mother topping up everyone's cup without asking. Ava wrapped her hands around her mug and let the warmth of it settle into her palms, and thought that sometimes the things you can't see the shape of yet are not the things you should be looking at right now. Right now, the coffee was hot. That was enough. The article did what articles do when they find the right current. It moved. By Monday morning, the Northeast Business Review piece had been picked up by 2 regional news aggregators and 1 national business publication that ran a shorter version under a different headline, something about ethical questions in private philanthropy that was less generous than Paulson's original framing. By Monday afternoon, Mason's lawyer had fielded 11 calls. By Monday evening, 3 of the investors in the Aldridge Group's parent structure had sent formal letters requesting an emergency review meeting. Ava knew all of this because Mason told her in the flat, precise way he delivered bad news. Standing in her parents' driveway Monday evening after dropping Lily at a neighbor's house, his jacket collar turned up against the November cold that had moved in overnight and decided to stay. "The meeting is Thursday," he said. "New York." "All 3 investors in person?" "2 in person, 1 by video." He looked at the driveway. "My CFO thinks I should offer to buy out the dissenting investor's stake. Clean break. Can you afford that?" He looked at her. The question sat there for a moment, not because the answer was complicated financially, she suspected, but because the directness of it was the kind of thing people usually danced around. "Yes," he said. "It would require liquidating some other holdings, but yes." "Then do it. It sends a message that the Millfield portfolio is a liability worth paying to remove. The alternative is spending the next 6 months managing a hostile investor who's already demonstrated he'll go to the press." She pulled her jacket tighter. "Which message do you want to send?" He looked at her for a moment. She had noticed over the past week that he did this, stopped, and looked at her when she said something he was turning over. It wasn't the look of someone who needed time to process. It was more like the look of someone who was checking something, verifying against some internal standard she couldn't read. "When did you get good at this?" he said. "At what?" "This." He gestured vaguely. "The strategic part. What's the move? What does it cost? What does it signal?" She thought about 12 years of surviving in a city on a salary that required her to make smart decisions or face consequences she couldn't absorb. She thought about negotiating her apartment lease 3 times in 6 years, about managing her coworkers' expectations while also managing her supervisors, about the particular arithmetic of someone who has never had a safety net, making every calculation twice. "Practice," she said. He nodded slowly. "I'll talk to my CFO tonight." She turned to go back inside and then stopped. "Mason?" She turned back. "The review meeting. What are they actually going to say?" He put his hands in his pockets. "That the Millfield portfolio represents a conflict of interest. That my prior personal connection to individuals who benefited from Hartwell's activities creates an appearance problem that affects the fund's credibility." He paused. "That I should divest from the community projects here and refocus capital on higher yield opportunities. And if they push for that formally," he looked at the darkened street, "then I have a decision to make about what the fund is actually for." She went back inside and stood in the kitchen and thought about that, about a man who had built something real and was now being asked to choose between the thing and the structure that supported it. She thought about how that was not a new problem, how it was in fact one of the oldest problems, how the structure always eventually turned on the thing. She thought about Mason at 20, inheriting money he hadn't asked for and responsibility he hadn't earned, with a father who treated empire building as a moral imperative and a temperament that apparently ran towards something quieter and more careful. She thought about how much of a person's life is spent trying to reconcile who they are with what they have. She went to bed and didn't sleep well, and in the morning she called Dana. "I need your opinion on something," she said. "Good morning to you too." "Sorry, good morning." She was at the kitchen window with coffee. Her father was at the bird feeder. The chickadees were there. This had become, without her noticing it, a morning routine she was attached to. "I need your opinion. On the man situation." "Stop." "Ava, it's obviously the man situation." She exhaled. "There's a business situation, and I can't separate it cleanly from the personal situation, and I don't know if that means I'm too close to think about it clearly, or if I'm exactly the right amount of close to understand what's actually happening." Dana was quiet for a moment. "Tell me the business situation." she told her. All of it. Hartwell, the investor, the article, the review meeting, the offer Mason might make to buy out the hostile stake. Dana listened without interrupting, which was not her default setting and meant she was taking it seriously. Okay, Dana said when she'd finished. The business situation is actually straightforward. The man has capital, he has a legitimate operation, he has an investor who turned adversarial for personal reasons, and he has a clean exit option that costs him money but removes the threat. That's not complicated. No. So the question is actually why you're asking me. Ava looked at her father at the bird feeder. Because if I help him navigate this, if I keep doing what I've been doing, I'm not a neutral observer anymore. I'm involved. Were you ever a neutral observer? She didn't answer that. Ava. Dana's voice was careful in the way it got when she was saying something she thought Ava needed to hear and wasn't sure how it would land. You extended your weekend trip into a week and a half. You reviewed corporate documentation. You talked to a journalist on his behalf. You had breakfast with the man and your parents. A pause. You were done being a neutral observer around day 3. That doesn't mean I've decided anything. No, but it means you're already in it. So the question isn't whether to be involved. The question is whether to be honest with yourself about the fact that you are. Ava looked at the coffee cup in her hand. When did you get wise? I've always been wise. You just call me when you're ready to hear it. Dana paused. How do you feel? Not what do you think. How do you feel? She looked at the yard, at the bird feeder, at her father's patient, early morning routine. She thought about Mason on the sidewalk outside this house, the careful way he'd stood at a distance until he was invited in. She thought about Lily's full arm wave from the swings and the horse or possibly dog drawing taped to the dashboard. She thought about a 17-year-old girl who had believed completely in a 17-year-old boy and spent 12 years building a version of herself that didn't need to believe in anyone that completely again. Terrified, she said. Yeah, Dana said. That sounds about right. They hung up and Ava stood at the kitchen window and her father came back inside and stomped the cold off his boots at the door and said, "Birds are restless today." The way he said things that weren't about birds. And she looked at him and thought about how well she knew this man and how much of that knowing had happened at a distance, in phone calls and occasional visits, and how different it was to be here, in the actual physical space of his life, watching him fill a bird feeder. Dad, she said. What would you have done if you'd known from the beginning, from when they first approached you about the house, that it was Mason? Her father hung his coat on the hook by the door with the deliberate care of a man who treats small habits as a form of order. He thought about the question the way he thought about most things, without rushing. I would have said no, he said finally. Why? He looked at her. Because I'd have thought it was about you, that he was doing it to get to you somehow. He paused. I would have been wrong, I think, but that's what I would have thought. She considered that. And now? Now I've had time to watch a person. He sat down at the table. Watching someone over time is different from having an opinion about them. He looked at his coffee cup. He fixed the Kowalski boys' situation, and the Kowalskis don't even know his name. That's not a man trying to impress somebody. She sat down across from him. He still should have told us. Yeah. Frank wrapped his hands around his mug. He should have. But I've kept things from people I loved because I didn't know how to give the thing and explain myself at the same time. It's a flaw, not a crime. She looked at her father, at the man who had never once said I love you in a direct, unguarded way, who had expressed it instead through every practical act of his life, through filled bird feeders and carefully folded dish towels, and the way he always made sure her coat was by the door before she went anywhere cold. You're defending him, she said. I'm describing him, Frank said. There's a difference. He took a drink of his coffee. What you do with the description is your business. She went to see Mason's on Tuesday, not because she'd planned to. She'd planned to spend the morning working, catching up on the remote consulting project she'd been neglecting for a week and a half, but because she woke up with the particular restlessness of someone who has been thinking around the edge of something and needs to stop thinking and just go look at it directly. His office on Ridge Road was not what she'd expected. She'd constructed something corporate in her mind. Glass, clean lines, the aesthetic of money. What she found was a converted farmhouse, the kind with wide plank floors and windows that let in more light than they probably should given the age of the building. There was a receptionist, a young man named Oliver, who looked about 25 and had the focused calm of someone who manages chaos professionally. There were 2 other people visible through an open doorway, working at desks. It looked like a functioning thing, not a monument. Oliver showed her to Mason's office, which was in the back of the house, looking out over a field that had been cut back for winter. Mason was on the phone when she came in, but he held up one finger and finished the call in under a minute. "My CFO," he said. "We're moving forward with the buyout offer." "Good." She sat in the chair across from his desk without being asked. The desk was old wood, clearly original to the building. There were papers on it, organized but present. The desk of someone who actually worked at it. On one corner was a framed drawing, clearly Lily's, of what appeared to be a house with an extremely large sun. "How's he taking the news?" "My CFO is relieved. The investor is going to be furious. He'll get over it. People who sell at a premium always get over it eventually." Mason leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "Why did you come?" She'd thought about how to answer that on the drive over. She'd thought about being oblique or practical or framing it as a follow-up on the Hartwell situation. "I have questions," she said. "Okay." "Not about the company." She looked at the field through the window. The cut grass was pale in the November light, the tree line at the far edge already bare. "About you. About things I've been piecing together, and I want to hear the actual version." He was very still for a moment, then, "Ask. After they separated us, after your father moved you, you didn't write. You didn't call." She kept her voice even. "For years I thought that meant you'd decided I wasn't worth the effort, that I was a hometown girl, and you were a sterling, and eventually the math had just become obvious to you." Something moved across his face. "Ava, let me finish." She looked back from the window. "And then I spent the last 2 weeks learning about a man who spent 4 years building an anonymous infrastructure to protect a town and the people in it, who wrote exit clauses into every agreement because he didn't want people to feel trapped, who structured an entire philanthropic operation specifically so that nobody would know it was him." She paused. "That's not a man who doesn't care about people. That's a man who cares so much that he's terrified of what happens when the caring is visible." He didn't look away. "Yes," he said, "just that. So I want to know which one it was. When you were 17 and your father moved you and you went silent, was it because you didn't care, or was it because you were scared?" He held her eyes for a long moment. The field was pale and still through the window. Somewhere in the building, Oliver was talking to someone in a low, professional voice. "Both," Mason said. "In different proportions than I'd like to admit." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and looked at his hands for a moment before looking back up at her. "My father told me it was over, that whatever I thought I had with you was a distraction, and I needed to focus on what was ahead of me, and he said it in the way he said things that were not actually suggestions." He paused. "I was 17 and he was the only parent I had, and I didn't have the tools yet to push back on him. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way to reach out once things settled. They never settled. No. And then I told myself enough time had passed that it was too late, that you'd moved on, that reaching out would be presumptuous." He said the last word with a kind of quiet self-contempt, which was an easier story to tell than the true one. What was the true one? He was quiet for a beat. "That I was ashamed of what I'd done, which was nothing, of what I hadn't done, which was fight for it." He looked at her directly. "I was a coward at 17, and by the time I wasn't, or thought I wasn't, I'd built enough distance that I didn't know how to cross back over it." She absorbed that. It landed differently than she'd expected, not like the explanation she'd spent 12 years waiting for because it didn't fix anything or change the shape of the years that had passed. It just sat there, real, imperfect. The kind of answer that doesn't resolve the question so much as confirm that the question was worth asking. "Renata," she said, "your daughter's mother, you loved her?" His expression shifted. Not guarded, more like the careful handling of something fragile. Yes, it was real. We met in Boston. We were young. It was fast and real, and she died, and it broke something in me that took a long time to assess the damage of. He paused. She knew about you. I'd told her. He looked at Ava. She told me once that she thought I used the distance from my past to avoid examining it. She was not wrong about that. Ava looked at the field through the window. She sounds like she was smart. She was very smart, and impatient with self-deception in a way that was not always comfortable. Lily has her eyes, Ava said. He looked surprised, that she'd noticed or maybe that she'd said it. Yes, he said. She does. The silence that settled between them then was different from the silences before. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things said, and now sitting in the room, taking up the space they needed. I want to show you something, Mason said. He opened his desk drawer and took out an envelope. Not recent, by the look of it. White once, now yellowed at the edges, with the particular softness of paper that has been handled many times. He set it on the desk in front of her. I wrote this when I was 18, after I'd been away for a year and was telling myself it was too late. She looked at the envelope. Her name was on the front. Her name and the Elm Street address. No stamp. It had never been sent. I wrote it and I didn't send it, he said, and I've moved it with me every time I've moved since then, which is... He looked briefly like a man aware of how that sounds. I know how that sounds. She looked at the envelope on the desk between them. At her name and handwriting she recognized from 15 years ago, the same handwriting, younger and less controlled, but recognizably his. Can I read it? Yes. He stood up. I'll give you some space. He left the room, pulling the door almost, but not entirely shut behind him. Ava sat alone in the office with the field through the window and the old envelope on the desk, and she thought about the particular courage it required to give someone a letter you'd carried for 14 years without sending. She thought it was either the bravest thing or the most reckless, and she wasn't sure the difference mattered. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages, in the close, slightly cramped handwriting of an 18-year-old trying to be precise. It began without preamble. I don't know if you'd want to read this, but I needed to write it because I've been carrying it around and I'm not good at carrying things. She read it slowly. It was not eloquent. It was not the carefully composed letter of someone with access to their full emotional vocabulary. It was a young man trying to explain, in real time, the experience of being moved away from something he hadn't understood was essential until it was gone. It talked about his father in the blunt, unprocessed way of someone who hasn't yet developed the distance to analyze a parent. It talked about missing Millfield in terms that were specific and concrete. The diner, the ridge road in October, the particular quality of light in the valley in early morning. It talked about her with a directness that was almost painful to read, the directness of someone who has no performance left because they're writing something they'll never send. I think about you every day, and I don't know what to do with that. I used to think I knew what to do with most things. I don't know what to do with this. Near the end, a paragraph that she read twice. My father keeps telling me that some things belong to a certain chapter, and when the chapter ends, you close the book. I don't think that's how books work. I think the chapters connect. I think what happened in one place doesn't stop happening just because you moved. I'm not sure how to explain that to him. I'm not sure I know how to explain it to myself. I just know that closing the book doesn't make the words stop being true. She sat with that for a long time. When she looked up, Mason was in the doorway. He hadn't come back in. He was leaning against the frame, looking at the floor, giving her space while also being present. The particular balance of a man who has gotten better over years at giving people room without disappearing entirely. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and set it on the desk. The chapters connect, she said. He looked up. That's the part that's true, she said. The rest of it is, a lot of it is you being 18 and not knowing how to say things. But that part is true. He pushed off the doorframe and came back to his desk, but didn't sit. He stood across from her with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the expression she'd been catching glimpses of for 2 weeks, the unguarded version, the one underneath the careful management. I'm sorry, he said. For the silence, for not writing, for building all of this around your family without ever asking if that was what they needed. He paused. For not coming to find you when I came back, even though I thought about it every day for 3 years. She looked at him. Why didn't you? Because I was afraid that what I'd done, all of it, would look like manipulation, like I'd built something to earn the right to show up. He looked at the desk, and I wasn't sure it didn't look like that. I wasn't sure it wasn't. She considered that carefully. It was the most honest thing he'd said, which made it also the most important. Is that what it was? She said. Honestly? He met her eyes. Honestly. No. But I can't prove that, and I understand if you don't believe it. She thought about the exit clauses, about the community surveys before any investment decision, about the local contractors and the anti-displacement policy and Paul Granger's kitchen table with the circled calendar dates. She thought about the woman cutting fabric in the mill building and Betty Marsh's roof and Tommy Kowalski's surgery, all of it done in the dark, none of it pointed at her. I believe it, she said. Something in him shifted, not dramatically, not a visible collapse of tension, just a small, quiet thing, like a door that has been held against pressure for a very long time being allowed to rest. But believing it doesn't answer everything, she said. I know. There are things that are still unresolved. I know that too. I'm not... She stopped. Tried again. I'm not in a place where I can tell you that it's all fine. It's not all fine. There are 12 years of things that aren't fine. Yes. And you don't get credit for the Hartwell work as a substitution for those 12 years. I'm not asking for credit. He said it simply, without defensiveness. I'm asking for the chance to be in the room, whatever that looks like. She looked at him across the old wood desk in the converted farmhouse on Ridge Road, with the pale November field through the window and the sound of Oliver's professional calm somewhere in the building, and a child's drawing of a house with an extremely large sun in a frame on the corner of the desk. She thought about being terrified. She thought about Dana saying that sounds about right. She thought about the chapters connecting. The investor meeting in New York, she said. I want to come. He blinked. That had not been what he expected. Why? Because I was in this town for 1 weekend, and I've spent 2 weeks getting to understand what you built here and what it means to the people in it. And if you're going in front of investors to defend it, you should have someone in the room who can speak to what it actually looks like on the ground. She paused. And because I want to see how you handle yourself when the pressure's real. He looked at her for a long moment. That's partly a test. Yes, she said. Most things are. He nodded once. Okay. Okay. She stood up. She picked up the envelope from the desk and held it out to him. Keep this. He took it, looked down at it. I thought you might want... It's yours. You wrote it. She pulled on her jacket. But I'm glad I read it. She walked toward the door and he said her name and she stopped. Thank you, he said. For staying, for all of it. He paused. I know it wasn't simple. She turned part way, not quite facing him. Nothing worth anything is simple, she said. You know that. She went out through the hallway past Oliver, who said goodbye with the smooth professionalism of someone who had definitely noticed more than he would ever comment on, and out into the November cold. And she stood in the parking area of the converted farmhouse on Ridge Road and breathed cold air and thought about New York on Thursday and about investor meetings and about the particular vulnerability of going somewhere as someone's what. She didn't have a word for what she was to him yet, or what he was to her, and she thought that was probably honest. It was probably the correct place to be. She got in her mother's car and sat for a moment before starting it. Through the farmhouse window, she could see, just barely, Mason at his desk. He was on the phone again, probably his CFO. His posture, the controlled and functional posture of someone with work to do. But he was holding the envelope with his other hand, not doing anything with it, just holding it, and she thought that was probably honest too. She started the car and drove back toward Elm Street, back toward the house that shouldn't exist, where her father would be in the kitchen with his coffee and her mother would ask about her morning in the careful way that meant she already knew more than she was letting on. Outside, the November sky was doing something complicated again with light and cloud cover. The kind of sky that can't quite decide, that keeps moving between one thing and another without settling. She understood that sky. She had been that sky for 2 weeks. She turned onto Elm Street and thought, New York on Thursday, one thing at a time. The house came into view and she pulled into the driveway, and she sat for a moment before going inside, watching the light move on the front porch, the maple tree in the yard with her father's repurposed stake still supporting the young branch that had split in winter. The branch had held. It didn't look perfect, but it was holding. She went inside. They took the early train to New York on Thursday morning, the 6:15 out of Concord that arrived at Penn Station just after 9. Lily was at her neighbor's house for the day. Mason had his lawyer's briefing documents in a folder on his lap and spent the first hour of the ride reading them with the focused, quiet attention of someone who prepares for things the way other people breathe, automatically, thoroughly, without making a production of it. Ava sat across from him with coffee from the station and watched the New Hampshire landscape give way to Massachusetts and then to the gray industrial corridor of southern Connecticut, and she thought about what she was doing on this train and why, and she came to the same answer she'd been coming to for days. Because the work was real, and the people it served were real, and when real things are under threat, the honest response is to show up. That was the practical answer. She was getting better at admitting it wasn't the only one. "Walk me through the investors," she said around Worcester. He looked up from the documents. "You don't need to walk me through them." He closed the folder. Richard Hale is the dissenting investor, 63, old money, made his real fortune in commercial real estate in the 90s. He thinks in terms of asset yield and portfolio optics, and Millfield represents neither. He paused. He also doesn't like being told no, and I told him no in August about the separate venture, which is the actual source of this. What was the venture? He wanted to acquire a portfolio of distressed rural properties and convert them to short-term rental inventory. He wanted me to co-invest. Mason looked out the window. I declined. Because it conflicts with what Hartwell does. Because it takes struggling communities and extracts value from them instead of building it. He said it simply, not as a moral proclamation, but as a plain statement of how he saw it. I wasn't interested, and he took that personally. Men like Hale always take disagreement personally. He picked up his folder again. The other two investors, Margaret Cho and David Pellerin, are more pragmatic. Margaret is concerned about reputational exposure. David is concerned about structural governance, whether there are adequate controls to prevent future situations where my personal history intersects with investment decisions. Are there adequate controls? He met her eyes. No, there weren't. I operated on trust in my own judgment, which is, in retrospect, not a sufficient governance structure. She respected that he said it without defensiveness. What are you proposing to address it? An independent advisory board with community representation, formal conflict of interest protocols, a third-party audit of all decisions made in the Millfield portfolio for the past 4 years. He paused. And a community ownership structure for the Millfield operations specifically. A trust, governed by local stakeholders, that takes permanent control of the assets and programs. Hartwell funds it. The town runs it. She looked at him. You'd give up control of it. I was never supposed to have permanent control of it. He said it with the evenness of someone who has thought about this carefully and arrived at a position that costs something. That was always the design failure. I built it to be self-sustaining, but I kept the governance in my own hands because I didn't trust the transition. That was wrong. She thought about the exit clauses in every Hartwell agreement, the right to walk away built into the foundation of every relationship. She thought about how a man could understand one principle completely and apply it imperfectly to another. You're better at giving people individual exits than you are at giving up institutional control, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, that's accurate. Why? He looked at his hands on the folder. Because individual exits feel like protection, like I'm making sure nobody gets stuck in something they didn't choose. He paused. Giving up institutional control feels like abandonment, like I built something and I'm walking away from it. Or it feels like trust, she said, which is harder. He looked at her across the train table. Outside, Connecticut was doing its flat, gray November thing, a landscape that asked nothing of you and gave you space to think. "Yes," he said, "that's the harder version." They didn't talk for a while after that. The train moved through the corridor and the coffee went cold, and somewhere around Bridgeport, Mason fell asleep against the window with the folder still on his lap. Not deeply, the light, restless sleep of someone who has been running on too little for too long. He looked younger when he was asleep. Not the 17-year-old version, not that exactly, but something less armored. Something that had not yet learned to hold its face in the particular careful way that years and loss teach you. Ava looked at him for a moment and then looked away, because looking at people when they don't know you're looking at them is an intimacy that should be acknowledged. She looked out the window at Connecticut and thought about trust, about how it was the one thing that couldn't be structured into an agreement or built into an exit clause, about how all the governance protocols and advisory boards in the world couldn't manufacture it. You either made the decision to extend it or you didn't, and making the decision didn't guarantee the outcome. And that was the whole problem with trust. It was unreasonable. It required you to accept that you could do everything right and still end up wrong. She had spent 12 years making decisions that reduced her exposure to that particular risk. She had been, in certain ways, very successful at it. She had also been, in certain ways, profoundly alone in a city of 1 million people, and she thought those two facts were related. The train pulled into Penn Station at 9:14 and Mason woke when it slowed, oriented himself immediately the way people do who are used to sleeping in transit, and picked up the folder without comment. They took a cab uptown to the law firm where the meeting was being held, and in the elevator Ava smoothed her jacket and Mason straightened his tie, and they looked at each other briefly in the elevator mirror with the shared acknowledgement of two people about to walk into something difficult. "I'll follow your lead," she said. "You don't have to say anything unless—" "I know. I'll follow your lead." The elevator opened. Richard Hale was already in the conference room when they arrived, which was a power move so transparent it was almost endearing. He was 63, as advertised, with the physical solidity of someone who has never had to worry about whether he looked like he belonged in a room. He glanced at Ava when she walked in with Mason, and something moved across his face. Assessment, rapid and not particularly warm, before he arranged it into the professional pleasantness of a man who has made a career of not showing his hand early. Margaret Cho and David Pellerine arrived together 2 minutes later. Margaret was in her 50s, precise, with the compressed energy of someone who runs on efficiency. David was younger than Ava expected, mid-40s, with the thoughtful, slightly abstracted manner of someone whose first instinct about everything is analytical. Mason's lawyer, a compact, dry-voiced man named Gerald Park, who had clearly been through situations like this before and had long since made his peace with human drama, opened the meeting with procedural efficiency. He outlined the agenda. He noted that Mason had requested the meeting be recorded, which produced a brief flicker of displeasure across Hale's face that he smoothed over immediately. Hale spoke first, which was clearly what he'd planned. He laid out his concerns with the careful, measured language of someone who has done enough of these meetings to know how to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. The core of it was this: that Mason Sterling had used the Aldridge Fund's capital to finance activities in a community with which he had personal ties, that this represented a conflict of interest inadequately disclosed to investors, and that the resulting reputational exposure threatened the fund's credibility and future fundraising capacity. He said all of this without once raising his voice or making a direct accusation, which was the professional version of a knife. Mason listened to all of it with his hands flat on the table and his expression controlled. When Hale finished, he didn't respond immediately. He let the silence sit for 3 seconds. Not from uncertainty, Ava could see, but deliberately, letting the room settle, letting Hale's performance complete its arc. Then he spoke. "Everything Richard has described is accurate," Mason said. "The personal connection existed. The conflict of interest disclosure was inadequate. Those are facts, and I'm not disputing them." He paused. "What I am disputing is the characterization of the Millfield portfolio as a product of those facts, rather than a sound community development strategy that I happen to also have personal reasons to care about." He opened his folder and laid out the documentation: the property value assessments before and after, The business sustainability data, the employment figures, the community survey results. He walked through it with the same flat precision he used when something needed to be true rather than persuasive. And Ava watched Margaret Cho's expression shift from careful skepticism to something more engaged as the numbers accumulated. Hale listened with his hands folded and his face professionally still. When Mason finished, he said, "The performance data is not the issue. The issue is governance." "I agree," Mason said, "which is why I'm proposing the following." He laid out the advisory board structure, the conflict of interest protocols, the third-party audit. He explained the community trust clearly and without overselling it, what it meant, what it would cost, what it gave up. He did not dress it up. He said, "I had control I shouldn't have had. Here's how I'm correcting that. Here are the costs. Here's what the outcome looks like." When he finished, Hale looked at the documents for a long moment. This is a significant capital commitment to a rural community development project that produces zero financial return. Correct? The fund's mandate is return-generating investment. The fund's mandate, Mason said, includes a designated percentage for impact investment, which is what this portfolio has always been classified as. That designation was disclosed at inception. I can pull the original prospectus if that would be helpful. Something shifted in Hale's posture, barely visible. A micro-adjustment, the kind that happens when a man realizes the ground he thought was solid has been measured and found sufficient by the other side. Gerald Park produced the original prospectus without being asked and set a copy in front of each investor with the smooth timing of someone who has been in position for exactly this moment. Margaret Cho was reading it. She looked up at Mason. The community trust structure. Once it's established, Hartwell's role is purely funding? Funding with reporting requirements. We see the financial statements quarterly. We have observer status on the trust board but no vote. And if the trust fails, if the projects become unsustainable under local governance, then we assess whether additional support is warranted and make that decision on its merits at that time. He paused. The same way any responsible investor would. Margaret looked at David Pellerin. Something passed between them, the shorthand of two people who have worked together long enough to communicate without words. "I can support the restructuring proposal," Margaret said. David nodded once. "I'd want the audit completed before we close the governance review. But yes, I think this is addressable." 3 people at the table had spoken. The 4th had not. Ava had been quiet through all of it, sitting one chair to Mason's right with her hands folded on the table and the particular stillness of someone who is present and listening and biding their time. She had been watching Hale, not Mason. She had watched Hale absorb the governance proposal and recalibrate and retreat to the position he would hold regardless of what logic was applied. The position of a man whose real objection had never been about governance. Hale looked at the documents. "I'm not satisfied that a restructuring proposal addresses the fundamental question of whether this fund should be managed by someone whose personal relationships have influenced its deployment." He looked at Mason. "And I'm not satisfied by the proposal to buy out my stake at the offered valuation." Gerald Park opened his mouth. Ava spoke first. "Mr. Hale." Her voice was even. He looked at her, the slightly surprised look of a man who had categorized her as decorative and is revising. "I'm Ava Bennett. I'm a Millfield native. I've spent the past 2 weeks reviewing Hartwell's operations on the ground, independently, with no interest in the fund's financial performance." She held his gaze. "I want to ask you something directly, if that's all right." Hale settled back in his chair with the expression of someone who is going to be accommodating for the moment. "Go ahead. Have you been to Millfield?" A pause. "I haven't? No." The Granger farm had been in one family for 4 generations. It was 6 months from foreclosure when Hartwell came in. It's now fully operational, debt restructured on terms the family can sustain, employing 11 local people, including a 61-year-old man who needed work that didn't destroy his body. She kept her voice level. Not warm, not cold, just true. "There's a building on the east side of town that was a derelict textile mill for 30 years. It's now a working space with 11 local businesses operating in it. A furniture maker, a tailor, a food producer, a leather worker. None of them displaced. all of them paying sustainable rent. She paused. A woman named Betty Marsh has run a diner in that town for 20 years. She was looking at closing 3 years ago. She's still open. She employs 7 people. Hale said nothing. I am one of the people whose family benefited from Hartwell's activities, Ava said. My family's home, my father's employment. Those are real things that happened because of how this fund deployed its capital. She looked at him steadily. And I want to be clear that I am not here as a character witness for Mason Sterling. I am here because I spent 2 weeks looking at what was built in that town, and I am telling you as someone who had every reason to be skeptical. It was built right. The people it served were not made to feel like charity cases. They were not made dependent. They were given room to stand up, and they stood up. She stopped. That's not a conflict of interest. That's a working model. The room was quiet. Margaret Cho was looking at Ava with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. David Pellerin had his pen down on the table. Hale looked at Ava for a long moment. Then he looked at Mason. I'll consider the buyout at the revised valuation, he said. My lawyer will be in touch with Gerald by end of week. It wasn't a concession delivered graciously. It was the move of a man who has calculated that the position is no longer worth holding. But it was the move, and that was what mattered. Gerald Park said something smooth and procedural about next steps. The meeting concluded. People gathered their documents. Margaret Cho touched Ava's arm briefly on her way out and said quietly, Well said. David Pellerin shook Mason's hand with the genuine warmth of someone who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. Hale left without additional conversation. In the elevator going down, Mason and Ava stood side by side, and neither of them said anything for 3 floors. Then Mason said, You didn't follow my lead. No, she agreed. You were better. I had better material. She looked at the elevator doors. I was talking about things I'd actually seen. They came out onto the midtown street into November air that was sharper here than in Millfield, carrying the particular edge of a city that does not make accommodations for weather or feelings. Mason stood on the sidewalk and looked at her, and the careful expression was entirely gone now, had been gone since she'd spoken in the conference room, and what was underneath it was tired and relieved, and something else she recognized from a very long time ago. Ava. He said her name the way you say something when the word itself is the whole sentence. Don't make it into something it isn't, she said, but she said it without force. I said true things in a room where true things needed saying. That's all. That's not all. She looked at him on the New York sidewalk with the city moving around them at its indifferent pace. She thought about the train and the folder and the early morning and all the days before it. The diner, the park, the mill building, the eggs at the kitchen table, the old envelope with her name on it in handwriting she recognized. She thought about 12 years and all the shapes that time had taken. No, she said. Okay, it's not all. He looked at her with that unguarded, slightly unsteady thing in his eyes. What do we do with that? She thought about it honestly. We go back to Millfield, she said, and we figure it out from there. One thing at a time. He nodded. Not disappointed. She could see he wasn't disappointed that this was in fact what he'd hoped for, the incremental version, the version that didn't require either of them to leap before they could see the landing. One thing at a time, he said. Starting with lunch, she said. I skipped breakfast and that meeting was 2 hours long. He almost laughed. Not quite, but close. I know a place, he said. Of course you do. They walked uptown in the November cold, not touching, not talking much, and it was nothing like the romantic version of that walk would look in a movie. There was no music, the light was flat and gray, they had to stop twice for aggressive taxi traffic, and once, because Mason's phone rang and he had to take it, stepping to one side of the sidewalk with one finger raised in the universal gesture of 1 minute, while she stood on the other side of a newsstand and looked at the headlines on magazines she didn't care about. But they walked uptown together, and that was the true thing. They came back to Millfield that evening on the 5:15 train. Lily was already home when Mason's truck pulled into his driveway. He'd called the neighbor from Penn Station. And she came out the front door at a run when she heard the truck, which was, Ava had come to understand, her standard operating procedure for arrivals. Daddy? She hit him at hip height with the full commitment of a child who has not yet learned to moderate impact. He caught her and lifted her without breaking stride toward the door. Did it go okay? Mrs. Patterson said you had a big meeting. It went okay, Bug. Is Ava here? Lily craned around her father to look. Hi, Lily. Ava was behind him on the path. Lily assessed her with those serious dark eyes. You look tired, she said, with the frank honesty of someone who has not yet learned that observation and commentary are different skills. I am tired, Ava said. It was a long day. Do you want to stay for dinner? Daddy makes good pasta. Mason looked at Ava over Lily's head with an expression that was apologetic and also entirely aware that his daughter was functioning as a more effective advocate than he was. Sure, Ava said. The pasta was, in fact, good, not transcendent. Mason slightly overcooked the garlic and undersalted the water, which Ava noticed and said nothing about, and the table was covered in Lily's drawings that had to be moved to one side to make room for plates. And Lily talked for approximately 70% of the meal about the woodland animal courtroom drama that was apparently a very serious theatrical undertaking. She had, she explained, been cast as the judge, which she felt was correct casting, and she wanted Ava to know that the trial concerned a dispute between a fox and a family of rabbits over a territory line. Who wins? Ava asked. I'm not allowed to say. It's a spoiler. Lily was very solemn about this. Seems fair. Will you come? Lily looked at her directly, the way children ask things, without the social architecture adults build around requests, no softening, no hedge. Just the question. Ava looked at her plate. She looked up at Lily. She thought about the fact that she had not made any decisions about what came next, about Boston, about her apartment, about her job, about the consulting project she had been neglecting, about the life she had built in a city where she was functional and competent and deeply uninvested in almost everything. She thought about a woman cutting fabric in a mill building. She thought about a tailor and a furniture maker and a beekeeper with jars of honey on a shelf. She thought about the kind of space where people who made real things could make them in proximity to each other, and what that might look like, and whether she was someone who could contribute to it or only observe it. She had a degree in design. She had 12 years of experience in marketing and creative direction for other people's visions. She had, buried under all the practical years, a thing she'd been doing since she was a kid, sketching spaces, drawing rooms and buildings, the way things could be arranged to feel like something. Yes, she said. I'll come to the play. Lily looked satisfied. She went back to her pasta. Under the table, Mason's hand found hers. Not a grand gesture. He just set his hand over hers where it rested on her knee, briefly, and then moved it back. Just that. Just enough. She called Dana the next morning. I'm staying, she said. For a while. I don't know how long a while is. Dana was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I knew it was the man situation. It's not just... Ava stopped. Okay. It's also the man situation. What about your apartment? Month to month since June. I can give notice. Your job? I've been consulting remotely for 8 months. I can keep doing that from here while I figure out the rest. She paused. There's a space in the mill building, a studio space. I've been thinking about what I'd do with it. What would you do with it? She'd been working on this, in the quiet morning hours at the kitchen table while her parents slept. Restoration work, she said. Design and restoration. Old buildings, old furniture, old spaces, helping people figure out what they have and what it could be. She paused. There's a lot of that here. There's a lot of things that need someone who can look at what's damaged and see what's still worth keeping. Dana was quiet again. Then, Ava, that's not just about buildings. I know, she said. I know that. She told her parents that afternoon. Her mother set down her dish towel and pressed her hands flat on the kitchen counter and looked at the window for a moment, and Ava thought she saw her blink hard once before she turned back around with the composed expression of a woman who has learned not to display the full amplitude of her feelings. You're sure, Carol said. I'm sure I'm staying for a while. I'm sure about the studio space. Ava looked at her mother. The rest I'm working on. The rest, Frank said from the table, without looking up from his coffee, includes a 32-year-old man with a child in a complicated situation. I know what it includes, Dad. He looked up. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying go in knowing what it is. I know what it is. She sat down across from him. I've spent 2 weeks figuring out what it is. It's complicated and unresolved and has a lot of history attached to it. She paused. It's also real. And I've spent 12 years being very careful about real things. Her father looked at her for a long moment. He had the look he got when he was weighing something, when he was being a father in the most considered version of that. Being careful isn't the same as being safe, he said finally. No, she agreed. It's just the same amount of alone. He absorbed that. He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when something landed where he hadn't expected it to. Then he picked up his coffee and said, "That spare key's on the hook by the door, in case you need it before you find a place." Her mother, by the window, exhaled in a way that was as close as Carol Bennett came to crying in public. Ava looked at the hook by the door with the spare key on it, and at her father's hands around his coffee mug, and at her mother's back, and she felt the full, complicated weight of being home. Not the idea of home, not the memory of it, but the actual thing, with all its imperfection and history and the particular accumulated love of people who are not good at saying so. "Thank you," she said, to both of them, to the room. She signed the lease on the studio space in the Mill building on a Tuesday in late November, 3.5 weeks after she'd arrived for one weekend. The lease was with Hartwell, now in the process of transitioning to the community trust, which would take several months to finalize, but the paperwork was moving. The rate was the same flat community fee she'd seen in the documentation she'd reviewed weeks ago. No percentage of revenue, no equity. The space was on the south side of the building with the best light. She stood in it alone the first morning after she had the key, in the early gray of a November day, and looked at the brick walls and the high windows and the wide plank floor that someone had sanded but not yet finished, and she thought about what it could be. Not perfect. It would not be perfect. It would be cold in winter, and the parking situation was going to be a genuine ongoing problem, and she would have to build something from nothing in a town of 4,000 people where she'd been gone for 12 years. She would have to do the slow, unglamorous work of establishing herself, which she had done before and would do again, and she was not naive about how long that took. But the light was right, and the brick was real. And next door, she could hear through the wall the faint sound of the fabric woman's scissors. Diane, she'd learned her name was, who made quilts and table linens and had opinions about thread count that could sustain a 40-minute conversation if you let them. She took out a notebook and sat on the floor under the best window and started sketching the space the way she used to sketch spaces when she was young. Not what it was, but what it could be. Mason found her there an hour later. He had Lily's school drop-off behind him, and a coffee from Betty's in each hand and the expression of someone who had thought about whether showing up was appropriate and decided it was. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her on the floor with her notebook. "You're already working." "Thinking about working?" She looked up. "Is one of those for me?" He handed her a coffee and sat down on the floor beside her, the way you sit when there's no furniture yet and you're not going to make a production of it. He looked at her sketch. "What's this part?" "Work table," she pointed with her pen. "Long, south-facing. Good for detailed work." She pointed to another line. "Display shelving here. And I'm thinking a small consultation area in the back, somewhere people can bring things and sit down and talk through what they have." He looked at the sketch. He was quiet for a moment, studying it with the genuine attention of someone who understands spatial problems. "The light's going to shift in winter. You might want the work table closer to the east wall." She looked at the space. He was right. She moved the line. "Better." "Yeah." They sat on the floor in the unfinished studio space with their coffees and the November light coming through the high windows and the sound of Diane's scissors through the wall, and it was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that gets remembered as a turning point. It was just two people sitting on a floor looking at a sketch of something that didn't exist yet, trying to figure out how to build it, which is, when you reduce it down, what most of life is. Ava had spent a long time believing that the careful, defended version of herself was the real one. That the girl who had loved without reservation at 17 was naive. That the woman who kept her distance and managed her exposure was the one who had it figured out. She had been wrong about that, and she had known she was wrong about it for longer than she'd admitted. And it had taken coming back to a town she'd spent 12 years avoiding to see it clearly. The truth was simpler than she'd made it. You could not build anything real while keeping yourself at a safe distance from it. You could be careful and competent and still end up with nothing that mattered. The risk was always there, of caring about something that broke, of staying somewhere that changed, of loving someone who was complicated and imperfect and present in the specific difficult way that real people are. But the alternative was Boston. Was functional and competent and alone. Was a life that fit perfectly because you'd spent years making sure nothing in it was large enough to require you to grow. She had outgrown that life quietly, without noticing, and come back to the place where she'd started to find that it had been waiting, not perfectly, not without damage, not without the particular awkwardness of things that have been broken and are in the slow process of holding, but waiting. Mason turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Lily wants to know," he said, "whether you're staying for her play." "I'm staying past her play." He looked at her. "I'm staying," she said. Just that. He held her eyes for a moment with the unguarded version of himself, the one she'd been catching in glimpses for weeks, and was only now getting the full measure of a man who was not easy and not simple, and had done both good and selfish things with roughly equal conviction, who was trying, imperfectly, to be honest about the difference, who had a daughter with someone else's eyes, and a letter he'd carried for 14 years, and a building full of people he'd helped without letting them know his name. Not a hero, not a villain, just a person, shaped by what had happened to him, trying to do something decent with what remained. She thought, that's enough. That's actually enough to work with. "Okay," he said quietly. They finished their coffees on the floor of the unfinished studio space, and the November light shifted through the high windows the way Mason had said it would, and through the wall, Diane's scissors made their clean and decisive sound. And somewhere in the mill building, the furniture maker was doing something rhythmic with wood, and the whole place had the feeling of things being made, imperfectly, incrementally, by people who had shown up and were doing the work. That was the story, Ava thought. Not the grand version, not the version where everything resolved into something clean and photogenic. The actual version, a town that was not dead, a man who was not who she remembered but was still someone she recognized. A studio space with better light than she'd expected. A child who had her father's opinions and her mother's eyes and absolutely no patience for spoilers. A spare key on a hook by the door. A repurposed stake holding a branch that had split in winter. Home, it turned out, was not a place you left and came back to. It was a place you kept making out of what you had with whoever was willing to do the work alongside you. She picked up her pen. She went back to the sketch. There was still a lot to figure out. That was fine. She had time.